Greetings, everyone. Thank you for joining us today in our fourth session of the Gene Drive Research Forum's series of panel discussions. In this series, we consider the case of gene drive technologies through social science theories on stakeholder engagement. The active participation of you, the registrants of the series, our expert moderator, and panelists providing a global perspective on the question should that make this discussion valuable even after the close of this Zoom session. I'm Royden Saw, and I represent the Genetic Biocontrol of Invasive Rodents Partnership, also known as GBIRD. In addition to GBIRD, this Gene Drive Research Forum series is co-hosted by the Gene Convene Global Collaborative. Today, we tackle the question, what is the role of consensus in stakeholder engagement? My friend and colleague, Karen Tuntas from Foundation of the National Institutes of Health, and I were very pleased that Dr. Synonym Bloss, Associate Professor at University of California, San Diego, accepted our invitation to moderate this panel's discussion. Dr. Bloss, I now yield the floor with gratitude.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to Karen and others at FNIH for the invitation to moderate this panel, which I'm very excited for. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and thank you to everyone who is joining us today to discuss this question of what is the role of consensus in stakeholder engagement. And I'd like to first introduce our panelists who really represent kind of a diverse range of viewpoints. And each of them, I'm going to say a few comments about their background. I could go on much longer because each of them is so accomplished in their own fields. But let me just start by saying a few words about Juan Dumas, who I am really thrilled agreed to join us today. Juan has over 20 years of experience in environmental and social conflict prevention and resolution. He is a founding partner at Meliquina Ltd, which structures business partnerships between developers, communities, and investors to share ownership of renewable energy projects in emerging markets. Juan has worked extensively as a mediator in processes convened under the auspices of the UN, World Bank Group, and other organizations internationally, including civil society organizations devoted to promoting dialogue to address conflict and build public policy. We're thrilled to have Juan join us today. Next, I would like to introduce Lina Finda. I'm absolutely thrilled that Lina is on our panel today. Lina is a research scientist at Ifakara Health Institute in Tanzania. Lina's current research focuses on interactions between malaria vectors and humans and developing alternative complementary tools for malaria control. Lina works as a liaison and a disseminator between Ifakara Health Institute and the surrounding communities. Lina is in the final stages of completing her Ph.D. studies, which are focused on developing and testing effective stakeholder engagement models for novel technologies for malaria control. Thank you so much for being with us this morning, Lina. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Edie Mcdonald. Edie has substantial experience combining social science theories with interdisciplinary methods to develop programs and interventions that support a more sustainable society. Edie recently completed a 3-year National Science Challenge research project that explored New Zealanders' attitudes towards gene drive for conservation purposes. The results of this work that Edie has done are assisting policymakers sort of rethink how they engage with the public over potentially contentious scientific tools. Other projects that Edie is leading include applying social science methodologies to understand and change behavior. So for example, for the purposes of increasing disaster preparedness in New Zealand families. So thank you so much for being with us today, Edie. I'd now like to introduce Francine Madden. Francine is co-founder and executive director of the Center for Conservation Peacebuilding, which focuses on transforming deep-rooted social conflict to create lasting solutions for society and the environment. Francine has successfully intervened in a wide variety of controversial natural resource conflicts to target deeper-rooted relational, systemic and structural conflicts that underpin natural resource challenges. I think Francine's going to bring an amazing perspective to our discussion this morning. Her work is focused on enabling the social conditions for long-term creative, collaborative, and shared progress to ensure that communities, Indigenous peoples, interest groups, industry, and governments, and the natural resources they value and depend on thrive. So thank you so much, Francine, for joining us today. And last but not least, I would like to introduce Steve Mulligan. Steve is the district manager of the Consolidated Mosquito Abatement District in Fresno, California. This is a public entity that's authorized and empowered to provide surveillance and control of mosquitoes and mosquito-borne diseases locally. Steve has previous research experience in biology and control of mosquitoes with an emphasis on field evaluations of chemical and biological mosquito control agents. Most recently, Steve was a primary collaborator on the Debug Fresno project, which was designed to evaluate the efficacy of Wolbachia to suppress Aedes aegypti mosquito populations. And the district's role in this project included monitoring mosquito populations, as well as public outreach and education and community engagement here in California. So I think Steve's going to have some terrific perspectives to share with us today. So thank you again to all of our panelists. It's just my pleasure to be able to talk with these professionals today. So before we jump into the discussion, I just want to make a couple of remarks to sort of level set our discussion today. I think certainly the inspiration for our panel today and perhaps the series more broadly is the development of gene drive technology for both conservation and public health purposes. But I think particularly for our panel today, while this was the inspiration, I think some of the discussions we'll be having will be broadly applicable to many other areas. And so I'm excited to see where our discussion takes us today. And I think what I also want to put out there for the audience today, as you listen to the discussion and think about what your questions are, is that I think what we've come to in kind of thinking about our panel previously is that there are really a diversity of views on what consensus is and what role it plays, if any, in the context of engagement. And I think one of the takeaways today is that this panel itself represents some of that diversity, and we will be surfacing that in our discussion today. And really the goal of this session is to thoughtfully consider what are the implications of these kind of diverse range of views for consensus. What are the implications for engagement work generally, as well as the implications for engagement work in the context of gene drive specifically. So with that introduction, I'm going to go ahead and kick it off with our first question, where we will hear from each of our panelists for about 1 to 2 minutes. And that question is as follows. So before we dive into the topic of consensus, I want to just open the session and hear from each of our panelists. Ask each of you to take a moment to reflect on the purpose of engagement as you see it. Specifically, in the context of your work, what do you consider to be the purpose of engagement, and what are some of the goals? And let's go ahead and start with Lina and then Edie.
Thank you very much, Synonym, and I'm really honored to be a part of this panel. Since I work in malaria control or studying various dynamics of malaria, in my context, the stakeholder engagement really is making sure that whatever solutions we bring to the affected, so this is whether if it's a country or the communities, meet the needs of those communities, or not just the needs, even the wants. So looking at our settings, for example, malaria is very dynamic at the global level. And even if you go to the local levels, it is dynamic. Even one community will be highly affected and the other one not so much. The social factors also show that variance in maybe who gets sick, who dies, and who survives it. So all those dynamics also require different interventions. So the different needs require different interventions. So when we bring solutions, for example, such as in this case, the gene drive, then you want to make sure that you're responding to the needs of those communities. And in order to respond, then you need to engage the communities. Also, engaging the communities makes sure that you consider the efforts that they are making, and whatever we bring complements those efforts instead of saying, oh, what you have does not work. Why don't you try my way? So engagement to me is making sure that you appreciate the efforts that has been made, and then you complement what exists. And in terms of the purpose, so in our case, the overall goal is to maybe eliminate malaria, but then there is that immediate aim. And that really varies among different stakeholders, and it also varies depending on the intervention or the program that you want to bring. And I hope we will be discussing that in this, but then in our case, obviously the overall aim is to eliminate malaria or to reduce the number of cases or deaths, but then the immediate aim would normally vary depending on time and the interventions.
Thanks, Lina. Edie?
Morena, and thank you for having me on the panel. In the New Zealand context, gene drive is being potentially thought of to control pest species in the cases that we looked at, rats and German wasps, that have had a real negative impact on biodiversity. So a little bit different context than Lina's. We're an island nation, and these pest species have, decimated our native bird and wildlife population. For me, engagement in our research really was a pathway to democratization of science. So in New Zealand has a proud history of using different tools across the board for social, environmental methods and different gains, but there's an expectation by the public that they will be asked and participated in the decision-making. So for us, we really went in, we did both quantitative and qualitative research. It came out quite strongly that the New Zealand public expects to participate in the decision about if gene drive is going to be used and all of the little details that need to go along with it. One of the interesting aspects we found is that the public expect engagement to happen now, even though the tool's not up and running, even though there's a lot of unknowns. However, when we interviewed the different stakeholders like policymakers, biologists, they were apprehensive about having any engagement because they didn't have the answers. And that's actually called the calling ridge effect, that when a new technology comes out and there's a lot of unknowns about it, people are hesitant to have public engagement. But it's at that particular time that public engagement can actually have the most effect on if and how that tool is going to be used. And if you wait until all the knowns are known, it's too late. The decision has already been made by the powers that be, and the public feels very disenfranchised. So in summary, for me, engagement is a pathway to democratization of science. And I think gene drive requires that in the New Zealand context.
Thank you so much, Edie. I love that you pointed out sort of some of the tensions, right, between different groups. Thank you. Let's go with Juan, and then Francine, and then Steve.
Thank you, Synonym. I am clearly not a scientist, and I'm pretty new to the gene drive technology discussion. What I have seen is that there seems to be like a recognizable pattern where, the project developers will say, yes, there's a community there. Let's get some input from them. Let's then work really hard on the technical aspects of this project. Let's figure it all out. Let's think it all through. And then we'll go and explain it to them. And when we explain it, they will like it. And then if they like it, they will agree with it. And so who wouldn't agree with something that, it's in their interest and in their benefit? But there are tons of assumptions along that line of reasoning. And, it may be well-intended, but it's very likely to go wrong. So to me, the question is whether a stakeholder engagement process is actually for engagement, or is it a stakeholder persuasion process? Can people say no? And communities will be asking themselves, are they listening to us, or are they trying to convince us? So I believe we can, go deeper into all of these issues in our session.
Thank you so much, Juan. Yeah, that's I think a key issue that you raised for us to consider today. Francine?
Thank you very much. I am even newer to this world than Juan, but glad to provide my perspectives from the world that I come from. So I act as a third-party neutral in deep-rooted social conflicts around natural resource issues. And when I think of the purpose of engagement, it is about what Juan was saying about giving real choice. People need to have a real choice in decisions that affect them. A good process allows for genuine inclusion, genuine diversity of stakeholders, which actually gives you, sometimes people get scared of that, like, because it does mean people who disagree with you, but it is only through that diversity and inclusion that you get a real 360-degree understanding of what the issues are. And that actually leads to better solutions and more sophisticated solutions. So not only do you avoid the imposing or trying to persuade people to your idea, which doesn't work because it produces at best a temporary agreement or commitment or solution, but also you get better decisions when you have more people involved, and in a genuine way. Solutions tend to be more long-lasting and more widely supported in a good process. You avoid or prevent unintended negative consequences. And you can turn what is often a vicious cycle of destructive conflict into a virtuous cycle of shared problem solving, which can then have a ripple effect to other issues in society. So that's how I look at the purpose of engagement. I will say in the context of this panel, and just because I recognize some people this might be the only thing that they're tuning into, and they haven't been to the other panels, which I haven't either. But just recognize that this element of consensus, it's a little like baking a cake, right? We are talking about one ingredient, let's say the leavening agent of what it means to make that cake. And consensus is one decision about that leavening agent. So we're already down in the rabbit hole of talking about a decision that's already been made about a decision-making process. If you go back up from that, the question really is, what decision-making model are you using? And then if you go up from that, it is all the different elements that make stakeholder engagement work, of which this is one decision around one point within that much larger context. So I just want to keep the context of this whole thing in light, because whatever you decide, consensus, not consensus, or whatever decision-making model, that really is only just one piece of a much bigger pie around stakeholder engagement.
Thank you so much, Francine, and thanks for making sure we can kind of zoom out to the big picture. And I think your point about it being sort of one ingredient, as we'll discuss today, there's some debate about that as well, right? So thank you for that. Steve, I'd love to hear from you.
Thank you, Synonym, and thank you for the invitation to participate. I'm looking at it from the public health perspective as an agency that it participates in the implementation and evaluation of the program, in our case, Wolbachia, and potentially Gene Drive. So what I'm looking at is for the engagement purpose and the goals is to provide a level of comfort and understanding, and based on our communication of our knowledge and expertise, and reaching out to the constituents, residents, and providing that. Also developing the recognition that a problem, an issue, or a risk exists. And in this case, it's a public health issue. And to try to work towards an understanding that some type of action needs to be taken, and also looking at or considering alternative methods and outcomes. Also, it's a way of giving back to the stakeholders a level of interaction. And we do that by not just listening, but actually hearing what they have to say, and acknowledging their concerns and discussing what that underlying benefit is, and discuss the process that we're going to be taking. However, this does not mean that this is a vote of the residents or constituents to go forward with the program.
Thank you so much, Steve, for those comments. And I think this concept of voting and and kind of how we think about kind of majority views will also come up later in the panel. So thank you so much. So I'd now like to turn to the concept of consensus and hear from each of our panelists about, for each of you, what you see as the role, if any, of consensus in an engagement effort. As Francine pointed out, this can be considered, potentially one part of how we might think about a larger engagement effort. But I think we also heard some issues being raised about that. So I'd like to hear from each of our panelists about, what role, if any, do you see for consensus in an engagement effort? And let's go ahead and start with Juan and then Francine.
Thank you, Synonym. I think it's important to start by defining at least what we mean by consensus, because there are often different meanings assigned to it. In my view, I've heard that I've heard many people talk about consensus as a synonym for agreement. So people say, have we reached consensus? Have we reached an agreement? And it is often used to refer to an agreement that everybody can live with, sort of an agreement that nobody really likes, but people have decided to go with so that they do not continue fighting or arguing. I actually disagree with this definition of consensus. I believe that if we look at the root of the word, sensus comes from, sensus is the Latin root for sense, meaning, and con is together. So consensus is working together to find a shared understanding, to reach a shared understanding, to make collective sense of the problem at hand and try to find solutions together. I believe that is consensus. So actually, building consensus is building that shared understanding. And after that, it is up to each stakeholder to decide which, or to make a decision. And that decision may be to agree or to disagree. So this may sound strange, but to me, there can be a consensus building process very well done. And in the end, the result is a disagreement.
Thank you so much, Juan. Francine?
See, now Juan has just turned around the definition that we were given to think about for this. And I can't argue with Juan at all on what he just said. I'm just now going to play off what Juan said and say that, so the definition that we were given was this idea that it was unanimous, right? And I really just want to say I love Juan's definition, but the idea of this unanimous agreement, that's, I think, where we will find disagreement, which I look forward to, because that'll be fun to have that debate. But just harking back to what I said before, that the role of consensus, if that's the question, and it was pitched to us as that was one option in what a group or what was chosen for a decision-making model. And so what is the role of it? Well, the role of a decision-making model is to help a group determine how they're going to make a decision, right, together. So you do that shared meaning making, right, that shared understanding, and then what does it look like to make a decision as a group? So the role of consensus, as it was given to us with this unanimous idea, is that everybody would agree. And I will pause on my comments on that, because I think we're going to have a discussion a little bit later about the pros and cons. But just recognizing that the decision-making model, again, just like baking a cake, it's kind of deciding what kind of leavening agent you're using in the baking of that cake, but it doesn't, the model, whether you're using consensus or not, and however you define it, does not define the cake. the cake is a much broader, lots of decisions need to go into that. But I'll leave it to the rest of the panelists.
Thank you so much, Francine. Yeah, we are going to have a chance, I think, to really pick apart sort of what we think about when we think of a consensus building process. So I think that will be a great discussion. But let's go to Steve. Steve, how do you think about the concept of consensus? What role, if any, do you see for consensus in engagement?
Well, I always check back with Merriam-Webster about definitions. It can be unanimity or group solidarity in sentiment and belief, a judgment arrived at by most of those concerned, or general agreement. Unanimity is, I don't know, I mean, that's, I don't know if that really sounds that great. I mean, is it good to everybody have the same idea and accept that? I think we can learn by considering other options and other opinions that people will have. And I'm not even sure if consensus, even general agreement is possible within groups, let alone between groups. And I think stakeholder groups, we need to separate the different stakeholder groups because they have different interests. And to try to think that you're going to have them all agree, I think it's can be counterproductive. I really, from my perspective, consensus building, I'd rather see building trust. And that's what we try to do is build trust within these stakeholders. And if that trust leads to a consensus, that's good. But if not, it's just that they trust us and what we are trying to accomplish.
Thank you so much, Steve. Lina, I'd love to hear your perspective on this.
Thank you, Synonym. I agree with the other panelists on this, that if we go by the definition of the unanimous agreement, then I don't think that is possible. But the building process is necessary, whether it ends in agreement or not. It is necessary to try and build it, because then at least you have some common ground that whatever decision you make, maybe it's favored, maybe not by everyone, but the majority. And looking in our settings, for example, in malaria control, we have a number of interventions that have been here for the past decades, like the bed nets or the indoor residual sprays or larviciding. And none of these have been agreed upon by everyone. I don't think there is even one technology or intervention in malaria control that is supported by every scientist or every biologist or every community members, but they still come and they're still here and they're being used. So I think the role of consensus itself, I don't know, but the process of building it, I prefer that, because even if someone says, I do not prefer this, they have discussed it and they know the reasons behind. So it's still necessary to try and achieve that, because I think in the process, you can still make people aware of whatever decisions they make, or you might be able to move people between the decisions. So I definitely agree with my friends here.
Thank you so much, Lina. Edie, I would love to get your perspective on this, and also if you might be able to comment on, how might, is it an important consideration to think about how different stakeholder groups might think about or define the concept of consensus?
Most definitely. So in New Zealand, you can't talk about the flora and fauna without talking about the Maori, our indigenous people who have right of guardianship over our flora and fauna. So when you talk about consensus, you most definitely have to talk about them. Some would argue that their beliefs and their support or not support for different tools to take care of our animals and our plants is the most powerful voice that should be heard and recognized. So we do this we're learning to do it a little bit better. Each time we have an issue that needs to be engaged at the national level. But I agree with Juan, consensus is more about building a community that has trust, and also that it's about building a shared understanding. It doesn't mean agreement. It doesn't mean necessarily 98% of the people check a box and vote for it, and then that happens. For me, I would step back and say, before you talk about consensus, you have to talk about the decision-making process, specifically in Gene Drive, and map it out. Who's making the decision? Who needs to be engaged with? How does the decision be made? You know, Steve said maybe it's a vote. For some communities, it may be a vote. For other communities, it may not. And that's really Synonym about mapping out who is going to be talked to. So who are the key stakeholders? To what degree their voice is going to play into the decision making. And again, in New Zealand, we have to absolutely, I believe that people that are number one at the table will be Maori. And Maori, the different iwis all have different voices, so that's going to be important.
Thank you so much, Edie. Let's see. So kind of moving up, kind of taking this thread about sort of the pros and cons of consensus, I would love to hear maybe Francine talk a little bit more about this issue. What are some of the pros and cons? We've kind of heard about this a little bit.
So I just want to say, I really appreciate this discussion because I love that you guys are all making me think. And so when I think of consensus, it is often used as the decision-making model. And I think embedded in whatever decision-making model people choose is this element of sense making, right? So is this element of trying to get mutual understanding, shared, getting all these different voices together so people can really take that 360-degree view of the problem and really understand it and move toward problem solving. And I think that these different kind of views on consensus, that this idea of consensus as this unanimous agreement was a way of building in the sufficient and rich dialogue and inclusive dialogue to fully understand that problem. And that the way to kind of guarantee that was to say, well, everybody had to agree. And so it theoretically forced this idea of, okay, we're really going to do this sense making. But then it gets shorthanded to, well, we just have to have a complete agreement, right? And then, well, so I think that kind of, I think when I think about society and sort of these origins of what sense making means and how it's kind of been shorthanded into the decision-making model, I will say that I think people can, I have facilitated many processes where people have gotten unanimous agreement across massive divides. So I don't think that unanimous agreement is impossible. I actually have seen it happen time and time again, but I don't think that that is the model that needs to be used. Whether you get it or not is one question, but what your decision-making model is. So that's where I'll go into the pros and cons. So the pros of a consensus, a unanimous agreement model where everybody has to agree. The pros of that are that it can kind of force that deeper sense making, right? Because if you really have to get to full agreement, then it kind of creates it mandates that space for it, potentially. If there isn't the trust, as Steve was talking about, then you're kind of lost anyway. But the other thing is people don't, it is a slower process. It is more risk averse, which you can look at as a pro or a con. But what happens is it is a slower process. You really dive into literally every aspect of the issue in order to try to get agreement. And so that may work for some cases. That flip it over and look at it from a con standpoint, and the fact that it is a very slow process, the fact that it is very risk averse means that there is no risk happening, right? And that might be a con. I think the biggest downside of a unanimous agreement and relying on that, whether you can get it with another type of consensus or another decision-making model, but But if you mandate that, then what happens is your last person or one person tends to have all the power, right? Because everybody can agree on something. And I say, well, I'm only going to agree if I get chocolate every day for the next 365 days. And then I'm basically tying you to what I want. Or unless I love the agreement, I'm never going to let go. And so I can always hold up that agreement. So I think relying on that concept that is pretty ubiquitous in society of consensus being unanimous agreement is most dangerous because of the power it gives one individual or one side. But I think you can use other robust decision-making models that really do get that deeper sense making. And then you may get unanimous agreement, but you're not relying on that, which means nobody has that holdout power.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad you brought us into the space of sort of who has power, right, in these sorts of processes. So I'd like to, we've been talking a little bit about different ways that we might define consensus. I'd like to just have, if I could ask Karen to put our one definition that we might not all agree on of consensus building in the chat so that the panelists can see it and all of the attendees can see it. But I'm just going to read it while it gets put in the chat. So one formal definition of consensus building is, quote unquote, a process involving a good faith effort to meet the interests of all stakeholders and seek unanimous agreement. So we've been talking a little bit about this issue of unanimity. The second part of the definition is a consensus building approach allows groups to reach an agreement among relative stakeholders and maximize possible gains to everyone. And so I'd like to have this group kind of continue to unpack definitions a little bit and maybe focus a little bit on this particular definition. We've talked a lot about the word unanimous already. So I'd like to kind of move and maybe talk a little bit about this idea of maximizing gains to everyone. I think this is sort of a noteworthy aspect of this definition and the notion of meeting the interests of all stakeholders. So how should we be thinking about kind of this goal in the context of stakeholder engagement? And I'd like to go ahead and start with Lina.
Thank you. So in terms of just the unanimous agreement, so in my understanding, that means like a common agreement among the stakeholders or within stakeholder groups. And I find that very difficult to achieve, I think. And especially if we go back to the gene drive technology, where the technology itself has varieties. It's not just one technology and you say, I go for this. There are different approaches within the technology. And then the stakeholders also vary. You have from policymakers to regulators to community members. So it's a web already. And when you say you want to achieve unanimous agreement, then is it just within one group or is it for one approach? During my PhD research, I did seek that the perceptions among different stakeholders, and really each group had a different preference, different levels of support, but one group wanted population replacement method, another group preferred to eliminate all mosquito species. Another group said, no, we cannot do that because of ecological issues. So it is difficult, even within one stakeholder group, it's difficult to really achieve that common agreement, let alone when you have diverse stakeholders. And then something else is the different stakeholders have different needs, different experiences, different levels of knowledge and awareness. So it's already difficult to, for example, have a common agreement, true agreement, when maybe one group is more knowledgeable than the other. So will another group be swayed? So I think, again, it's a difficult one to achieve, but this should not really limit the importance, or it should not underplay the importance of engagement itself. It's just that this consensus as maybe one aim of engagement might be difficult but it still does not underplay the need to engage. Yeah.
Thanks, Lina. Edie, I know you've been thinking about some of these issues as well. Do you want to chime in here?
Sure, I was just looking across the chats and having some side conversations on the chat. I think for me, when it comes to this idea about consensus building, I would not necessarily agree that it's about maximizing so that everyone wins. I think someone else put another definition in the chat that a different definition is about compromising so that nobody wins, but everybody feels okay giving up enough. And for me, I think that's the more critical definition as we move things forward. And there may be a point, and it's context specific, again, in the New Zealand context, it may be that no one feels comfortable moving forward. There might be positives and negatives, but still at the end of the day, the decision has to still be on the table not to move forward with using a variety of tools, and Gene Drive being one of those. So I think that's for me at the heart of it, is that it's not about unanimous decision or that everyone maximizes. It's so that there is always the option to not support that tool for a variety of reasons.
Thanks, Edie. And I'd love to hear Francine's comments on this as well, and to kind of perhaps pick up some of these threads from Lina and Edie. This idea of maximizing gains to everyone, but also kind of considering Lina's point about sort of different characteristics of different stakeholder groups and potentially different, kind of power differentials as well. Francine, would love to get your thoughts on these issues.
Yeah, there's so much you guys are talking about, and then I'm like looking in the chat as well, and I'm like, oh my God, these are great questions. You can't ever balance power, but a process should, as much as possible, balance power, because the more that power is balanced, the more respect and trust is built in that space, the more people feel comfortable speaking their truth, which then leads to people having a sense of real choice, which leads to genuine commitment to whatever the group decides. So that power piece is critically important. And another thing on this idea of unanimous agreement, when I talked about how one group or one individual could have a lot of power, recognize also that some individuals or groups either politically or institutionally may be okay with something, but they can't actually agree to it, right? So people sometimes need some safety to stand aside rather than because it's too politically risky for them to say yes to something. So a couple things on that. This idea of maximizing possible gains for all. I think there's a couple different roads I want to go down on this one. One is oftentimes, and this could be one of those cases, that the goal or the discussion or what's on the supposed agenda is about what one side wants, right? So you all may or may not want this Gene Drive thing, right, that I'm just learning about. But the reality is that may not be some of the core needs that other stakeholders around the table have. And so it can convey unintentionally, but it can convey a disrespect and a lack of dignity for other people if your convening is about what you want and you're convening a process around what you want, and it's not inclusive and expansive to what the needs of the other individuals and groups around the table are. So I think it's a challenge that people have, is because a lot of people work in the box of a subject matter, a topic, a goal, and then they're trying to get everybody else to come along with that. What I have seen where unanimous agreement is more easily achieved and it's genuine and happy and people feel good about it is when you can expand the pie to include the goals, the interests of other people. And so what you want is just part of a larger pie that is inclusive of what everybody wants or whatever it looks like. And I can give you an example of this as a case where one organization I was brought in to do a conflict transformation process where there were diverse stakeholders. One entity really wanted goal X. It was a conservation agenda. And they had been trying for 15 years to get it and they never got it, right? And when I came in, I changed what the topic was, which was much more expansive to include what the other entities, communities, et cetera, wanted, and had them all go through something where they came up with something, an inclusive plan together, and inclusive in that was what this one entity wanted. And they got unanimous agreement. So keeping that in mind, the other thing is a lot of times what people want or need, we think about those in terms of tangibles, but I want us to expand our minds to think about the intangibles, the dignity and respect, the recognition, meaningful say in decisions that affect you, having people's identity being secured and legitimized. And sometimes those symbolic intangibles are just as important, if not more important, to a community or group than what is tangibly on the table. And so again, your stakeholder engagement process can meet those needs, even while, so those needs are being met, and those are part of very real human needs, while you're also addressing some of these more tangible goals that you may have. So in defining maximizing possible gains, realize it can be a suite of tangibles, but don't forget the intangibles as well, which can be more important.
Thanks so much, Francine. So I want to also kind of continue to unpack this definition that we have in the chat. And I think another sort of key phrase is good faith effort, right? And so I would love to hear from a few of our panelists. Let's maybe start with Juan, to kind of consider this question of who did, kind of if we consider, sort of different forms of consensus to be an important part of engagement, who determines when that's been reached, and who determines when a process has been a good faith effort, and or kind of when the interests of different stakeholder groups have been met. And we can kind of, I think, pick up on this thread of power differentials as well in this landscape. So Juan, what are your thoughts on this?
Thank you, Synonym. First, let me say that I believe that my view of consensus doesn't collide with the definition, because the definition says that we are seeking an unanimous agreement. We may not reach it, but that's what we're trying to do. And I agree, when we engage, we have the hope that we will reach some kind of agreement. But as you point out, I believe that good faith efforts is an important part of the definition. And I believe it's up to the parties to decide whether this has been a good faith effort or not. And you can always have an external observer who thinks that he or she is smarter than everybody and can decide whether something has been good for a community or not. And I think that's arrogant. What I can tell you is, in my view, what are the criteria that I believe help us understand whether something has been a good faith effort or not. The first one is, as Steve pointed out, is has this been a process that tried to build trust? And trust is built in deeds and also in words and in language. And usually scientists are not very good at speaking to non-scientists and engaging with non-scientists. And so, for example, things that are really basic for scientists aren't that basic for people like me. I remember the first time I heard the words, "No evidence of harm is not the same as evidence of no harm." I was like glazed for a few minutes, and then I realized how important that was. And then I've then used it with other people, with other friends, to impress them. It's important that these very basic concepts can be explained to people who are not familiar with them. But then, even if we explain that, and we don't need to treat them like 5 years old, the fact that we're not scientists, we're not children. But then, even if we understand that, then there's a whole issue about honesty, about uncertainties. Because in general, in my experience, scientists do not give a very straight answer. So if someone asks, okay, but will this be harmful for us or not? And scientists normally start the answer with, well, evidence suggests that, right? And you will, I haven't heard scientists say, no, don't worry, this will be fine, right? So there is some level of risk and some tolerance of risk that can, vary from one community to another. So being very honest from the very beginning about what we know and what we don't know. And that also takes me to the issue of timing, which was brought up by Edie. So the earlier you bring people in my view, the better. It's important to share what you don't know and build knowledge together as you go forwards. Otherwise, people will feel that you're hiding something from them. And what's worse, people will probably feel that the decision has been already made somewhere else, and they will feel that they don't have a chance to say no. So I believe all of these things together help you determine whether a process has been a good faith process or not. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. I would love to also hear from Steve about this question, especially given kind of some of your prior work, Steve. What are your views on this idea of a good faith effort? How do we determine that?
Okay, one thing I do want to follow up with what Juan said, and about being open and honest, and also communicating, what you're doing without scientific jargon, and and the oceanographer Robert Ballard said, if you cannot explain what you're doing to a 5-year-old, you don't know what you're doing. And I think that really, says a lot. We have to explain it, simply what we're doing. We don't always know the outcomes. And scientists, sometimes they're not definite because there is always an element of risk when you're doing something. When you see a benefit, there's a risk, there's confidence levels. A lot of people may not accept that, but it's true in science. But when we're hearing from stakeholder groups, I think it's important to know that we don't always hear from those stakeholders that are more affected, those that are underserved, those that really don't have a voice or cannot share that. And those we need to have somebody that's going to pick up the gauntlet of them and for them, oftentimes from a public health perspective. And Lina, I'm sure, knows that. Sometimes we just hear from the loudest voices, have an expectation that what they say is going to occur, and they're not really looking at other concerns or other perspectives.
Thanks, Steve. I see Edie has her hand raised, so let's hear from you, Edie, and then I want to turn it over to Lina to get her thoughts on this issue as well.
Sure, I just wanted to pick up on something that Steve said. In our work that when we go into communities to discuss not necessarily gene drive, some pretty basic conservation challenges, for example, just how to increase the population of kiwi, which is the national bird in New Zealand. If we drive up into a community that perhaps is marginalized, they could not untangle us as a government agency from all the other government agencies that drive up that want to talk to them. So I think this dream of consensus building is about building trust. It would be fantastic, but I think we're setting us up for potential or unexpected or unrealistic expectations for what consensus and engagement is. I think it's going to be absolutely essential as we move forward to potentially roll out Gene Drive for a variety of different uses or start engaging with communities to discuss the rollout, that we have to accept that it will still be seen as a top-down initiative. And that I really wish there would be a lot of trust and understanding, but especially in today's climate, I think it's going to be incredibly difficult. And you cannot talk about Gene Drive without talking about all the other history in that region, within that marginalized group with those people. So you really, however time you think it'll take to consensus, I would add 3 to 5 years.
Thanks so much, Edie. yeah, I think the issue of timing is such a complex one, and you raise a number of other really key issues. I'd love to hear from Lina on this issue, and then Francine, we can go to you, if that's okay.
On the issue of timing?
Just, I mean, any reactions you have to some of the comments that have been made, but I think this question of sort of a good faith effort, what it means to have a good faith effort, and how do we know when we've achieved it?
Yeah, definitely. I agree with Steve that sometimes the underrepresented communities, we don't hear from them a lot of the times. And here in Ifakara, we actually do try to make efforts and go to them and say, what are your opinions? And that is really a core part of my PhD, was to have different stakeholders. I had 5 that were equally represented. Scientists were among them, and policymakers, and community members were definitely also equally represented. And from them, then you do find out that they do have they have their opinions. They have lived experiences of what, for example, malaria is like. They have had their children sick or die because of it. So they often know what they need or how they want this fight against malaria to go. And when you go to them with, for example, these technologies, in this particular case, Gene Drive, they had a lot of opinions on how this could work for them, or their different preferences. But again, my point is, I think this will come later when we discuss about time, is that when one stakeholder group has a preference, and I think in this case, we all agree that the communities in malaria endemic settings, those should be the most important stakeholder group, have a preference for a particular technology or how this technology should be implemented in their setting. And then those opinions are not taken into consideration. So to me, that is definitely not a goodwill effort. Are we engaging them just so that we say we have engaged the communities and then we've ticked the box? Or do their opinions actually matter? And how do they matter when the scientists that are actually working in these technologies have never stepped a foot in the endemic settings, for example? So whatever we present to them is a hearsay. They have not seen how these people live. So to me, I think a goodwill effort needs to have maybe the scientists that are working actually experience these settings, experience what people are living, and take into consideration the needs or the opinions that the communities have. Just to add in that, in Ifakara area, the community members had a strong preference for population suppression approach. Understandably, because here a mosquito, one of the journalists that we interviewed said, mosquito is like a snake. When you live in an area where snakes kill people, you cannot bring another snake and say, hey guys, this is a safe snake, it will not kill you, so we won't kill it. We will just put it aside. So mosquitoes are like that. When people experience multiple children dying of malaria, you cannot say, I'm going to bring mosquitoes that are safe, because a mosquito is a deadly animal here. But so the community members, sorry, excuse my English, would prefer eliminating the entire species. But the biologists will come and say, no, you cannot do that because some spider will not get its food. So I think these, the values that we place, and again, taking into considerations the need of the people that you're actually designing this technology for, when those needs are not taken into consideration, then I don't think we can achieve true consensus in that case.
Thank you so much for those points, Lina. Really appreciate that. Francine, you're muted.
I was so busy trying to lower my hand that I didn't take myself off mute. So many good comments by my fellow panelists and people in the chat. So this whole idea of a good faith effort, as a third party neutral, I'll just say from my standpoint, I am never the one to determine if the process is good. It is always the participants who need to determine whether that process met their needs, whether it was a good process, whether it was a fair and legitimate process. Realizing processes, people can come up with solutions, but what moves people toward retaliatory anger, what moves people toward revenge anger is the process of whether that feels fair, inclusive, and legitimate. So the process is really critical. That might get to one of the chat questions about sort of what some people call like troublemakers, what I think was the term that was used, or spoilers. Oftentimes what's happening with folks who seem like they are spoilers or troublemakers, those are people who feel like they have not been included in a fair, legitimate, inclusive process. And we talked about this, so this gets into the issue of power, right? So there's formal power. So this goes to a little bit to Edie's thing, is that the government is coming in or whatever and saying, hey, and then that all that history, all that like baggage comes into the current discussion. So the approach that I use in addressing conflict and stakeholder engagement is called conflict transformation. And we specifically use that approach because it is designed not only to address this broader system engagement, because whatever issue you're working on is really a microcosm of what's going on in that society, but it is also meant to go deeper than the issue at hand to reconcile that deep-rooted identity conflict that exists. Maybe that's outsiders coming in and telling us what to do. Maybe that is scientists coming in and imposing, blah, 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 blah. Maybe it's that. Maybe it's government, a perception of government intervention, or maybe it's a perception that communities aren't smart enough to make decisions for themselves. All of those prejudicial assumptions, that us versus them, will always come into whatever topical decision-making you're addressing. So you have to have a process that reconciles that deep-rooted conflict, because you can't get away from it, right? It's there. So you have to address the reality that you're in. To me, a good faith effort and balancing that power means reconciling that deep-rooted conflict, because power is a source of that identity conflict. It creates that, or perpetuates that us versus them. So what might this look like? So one of the reasons that communities often feel like they're tokens, or that communities react in they go outside that formal process in order to influence that process, is because they don't feel they have genuine power. They get labeled as the troublemaker, as Ivan or Yvonne said in the chat. But what they're doing or saying may have more to do with not feeling like that process is fair to them. So a lot of times when I have a process that involves communities that have long been oppressed or marginalized, they are in the majority in that room, right? So you will have more of them there, because if there's only one or two of them, then they're going to feel like they're a token, it kind of getting to Lina's point, that they're kind of a token brought in the room, and they don't really feel like they have genuine voice in that discussion. The point is, it's that larger process, how that's designed, but reconciling that identity conflict is really critical to leveling that playing field, so that people feel like they have a genuine voice, a genuine say in that process.
Thanks, Francine. And I think you've given us a nice segue into the audience Q&A part of our panel this morning, referencing this comment that's been put in the chat. And what I'd like to do, I think it's a great comment and a great prompt. I'm going to read it, and then perhaps we could hear from others on the panel their thoughts on this question. Maybe Juan, we could start with you and then move to Edie if the two of you have thoughts on this. So here's the comment. I'm not sure who submitted it. Please describe what your approach would be in dealing with quote unquote troublemakers in the community who, irrespective of the perceived benefits of a technology, will always sway the community with half-truths and conspiracy theories. Unfortunately, I'm reading verbatim, unfortunately, they are usually the influencers in the community. And this person goes on to say, further, in Africa, oftentimes there is a political connotation with some public health interventions. How do you also deal with this? So Juan, Do you have thoughts on this?
Sure. Thank you, friends. Thank you, Synonym and Anna. I would like to say that I agree with Francine's comments on this. At the same time, I would like to add something that, I think it's important to start by treating everybody as if they were operating in good faith and give them a chance to, but at times we find people who are not operating in good faith and they are boycotting actually a process because essentially because they're looking for personal gains. And some of those personal gains may be illegitimate as well. So I think it is very, very important to make the process as transparent as possible so that the community can start getting information from other sources other than from those particular people. And if we can break that sort of firewall in terms of communication with the community and the community starts seeing the whole thing, then it is up to the community to decide whether this is actually beneficial for them or not. And if they start seeing that it's beneficial for them, it's very likely that this person will turn it off because they will, he or she will start feeling or finding him or herself in a situation in which they're now against the current. So I believe that's an important approach. There's one other thing that I believe is also important is the approach that has been taken to the entire process from the very beginning, to the entire project, I mean. So the question is, are we negotiating with the community the price of peace for this process? So are we negotiating some kind of a price so this project can go forwards? Or does the community own this project with us? And if they are owners of this project and they see the benefits of this, then troublemakers will have a harder time.
Thank you so much, Juan. I would love to get further reactions, as I mentioned, from you, Edie, if you'd like to contribute, and then perhaps Lina as well.
Sure, Synonym. I actually embrace troublemakers. I think it's important to have troublemakers in the community. It keeps those who are making decisions, generally government agencies or big businesses, honest. And we all know there's numerous instances where government and big businesses haven't been necessarily honest. So troublemakers generally aren't troublemakers just for attention. They legitimately come with core values, and the actions they see go against their core values. So in New Zealand, I always advocated for a cup of tea budget when it came to engagement. This is when someone in New Zealand within one of the government agencies that was respected and was high enough that they were seen as important to send out to this individual, sat down and had a cup of tea and discussed things with them. And they listened, and we worked with them on what were some of the opening sentences. It wasn't about to convince, it was just to be there to listen. And then, like Steve and Juan have said, it's also about how you implement the entire process within your community. So being transparent about that, but also involving them. So if there's infrastructure that needs to be built, hire someone local so that you're giving jobs to the local. And then when you see each of those little gains are going, this person who's perceived as troublemaker, he or she may never agree, but they'll be witness to the benefits that are coming within the community. And at the end of the day, when there are initiatives that need a decision to move forward, that decision goes forward and that individual may not agree with it, but they can agree to disagree with the decision. And we had numerous examples in New Zealand where when you do that engagement correctly, you can move things forward when it comes to conservation and biology. And it doesn't result in everyone agreeing. In fact, it can still be quite contentious, but you can't neutralize the troublemaker. You can only keep talking to them, and that's essential.
Thank you so much, Edie. Lina.
I saw a comment below that one that there will always be differing points of views. And I wanted to say that I think a biggest example is the vaccinations, that you will always have people that are against that despite the benefits. And in Gene Drive, there is no way that everyone would agree with this technology. But again, like the others said, the transparency, and in our settings, raising awareness too, like continuing to bring out correct information. I think that definitely will help. I had a point. And then also a bigger one is responding to those concerns. For example, even if it's a conspiracy, then you can say this is wrong, but it could work this way. My only said in gene drive, for example, in the research, now I think this would go into timing, is that when the research is in its infancy, like gene drive, you don't have all the answers. If they say, oh, we will have mosquitoes as big as an elephant, you can't say yes or no because you haven't done long-term research. If you say mosquitoes will start transmitting HIV, you don't know that either, the modified mosquitoes, sorry. So when, in the case when a technology is so new, like this one, it's so early, the scientists themselves don't have, there isn't so much of the correct information known yet. And this does give room for the conspiracies. And I think that although the early engagement is really good, but it also again opens up the door for the conspiracy theories like this. And I think, so in this case, it's just making sure that the correct information is released as soon as possible as it is discovered. And then I think that would help.
Thank you so much, Lina. I think, Francine, I see your hand. I think that this also brings up some of the discussion we had in our planning session about sort of the role of language and communication and framing of issues, and then how these things might be conceptualized in the context of, as you were just saying, Lina, kind of early engagement versus, engagement just at different points in the timeline. So I would, I'll turn it over to you, Francine, but I would also just love if the panelists could consider this issue of language, communication, and how it intersects with timing. And then we can hear from Francine and then maybe move into this issue of communication.
Yeah, thanks. I'm like Edie, I also really like troublemakers, so-called troublemakers, because they bring a lot of energy and a lot of diverse perspectives. And there are different kinds of, people fall into different categories. So they may be a spoiler or troublemaker because they're not getting their needs met for legitimacy of their identity or recognition or a voice in the process, right? We often call those spoilers. But it may be, there may be some self-interest or some need to constantly be that outside agitator. So there is no intent in ever wanting to be a part of that collaborative process. So you can't lump people, you have to get to know sort of what their motivations are. But I would say that if you are in a situation where there is somebody who has, there really only is this self-interest, or there really is only wanting to be this outside agitator, then you still need a proxy for those views in that room, right? You can't, it still has to be inclusive, but inclusive through a proxy. And I do want to address Hector's comment because he brought it up early on in the chat and he brought it up now. And he wanted an example where a decision didn't go forward. And I can give an example of a colleague of mine, and I think this is who had been part of a process, and it was a process to decide whether a species should be reintroduced. And they went through this process with all of the different stakeholders. And at the end of that process, they had built the relationships, they built the trust, they had really weighed the pros and cons of whether to do it, and they decided against it. And in the short term, if you look at that, you might say, well, I guess that was a failure. But I would say, was it really? Because at some point, this species is actually going to come back into that area on its own, right? It will migrate into that area. And at that point, because the identity conflict, that us versus conflict had been reconciled, right? This was pro-conservation versus agricultural interests, et cetera, government, citizen, et cetera, because they actually had that trust and were able to say, okay, since we didn't get some form of consensus, some form of agreement, we really hurt each other and it didn't go forward. Even if 20 years later, that wildlife species moves back into that area, then you'll get less conspiracy theories about the fact that they were secretly reintroduced because it was respected. The decision was respected. And now when they talk about what does it mean to coexist with this large predator, they can actually start from a better working relationship. So that is an example where a decision didn't go forward, and recognizing that that doesn't mean it's a failure. That means that it's setting itself up because we're all in the infinite game here. This is the long game of humanity, really, and moving forward together as a society.
Thanks so much, Francine. So let me, I'll invite the panelists to comment on communication and timing, but I also just want to put this comment in the chat on the table as well, because I do think it's really important, and Francine kind of got us into this discussion as well. So the comment is, regarding the decision-making process, can someone on the panel provide an example where stakeholder engagement led to something that did not go forward, as Francine said? And in those examples, was achieving consensus the criterion for proceeding? So we've got a lot of different threads going right now, but I do want to, perhaps, I think it would be great if we could hear from Steve. Steve, if you have comments you want to make either about this most recent prompt, or I know you've thought a lot about sort of communication and timing of engagement as well in some of your projects.
Okay, what was the question? Whether it changed the outcome, or whether it stopped the project from moving forward?
Whether engagement led to something that did not go forward.
Okay, in our case, it did not. But again, what we tried to do is respond to all questions, concerns. But I think, going back to the troublemaker issue too, you're going to hear from people who are upset or don't want to protest. I think you need to determine whether that is because of misperception, they don't understand, or whether that is an agenda, self-interest that was brought up. And then you have to determine, okay, is that self-interest of their agenda, or is that selfishness where they're overlooking the concerns and needs of others? And I think that's it's important to look at, okay, are these concerns something that really is going to change the outcome? We always try to answer questions. We want to reach out to those individuals that have concerns, that and try to explain, from our perspective, what we're doing. But at the end of the day, sometimes that's not enough. But again, then you move on to other issues and other individuals.
Thanks, Steve. Let's go to Juan and then Lina.
Thank you, Synonym. I wanted to comment on Hector's question or comment as well. Hector, in my daily life, I work together with communities structuring renewable energy projects, and where they come in as shareholders. And so I've been doing my research about how this has been done elsewhere in the world, and particularly in Canada, where I believe they're way ahead of all of us. And in speaking with some leaders of companies over there, I heard repeated stories of companies engaging with communities, sharing all the information, doing everything we've said today. And then when the community came to a decision, they would say no, right? And they would say, keep negotiating, right? If you want to come back, you need to keep negotiating with us, with another proposal. And so they've actually done a series of iterations over many years to actually be able to come to an agreement. And they finally did come to an agreement. But there are other cases in which they haven't come to an agreement. So I believe there are I can give you more examples, but I know that in the interest of time, I shouldn't. But there are examples from Mexico and also from Canada. I can follow up on that.
Thanks, Juan. Lina and then Edie.
This is in response to Hector. So I work at a research institution, so you can imagine that there are a lot of projects that stop because a certain group of stakeholders say no. So that is common to us. And the most recent, and I'll try not to say the name of the project, I'll get in trouble. But it's a clinical trial that is done in 3 different countries, and it involves mass drug administration, also for malaria control. And I think all the other top levels stakeholders had agreed, the government officials, the regulators, and then when it got to the community members, they say, no, we do not want to take drugs. And at that point, there is really nothing much you can do. But normally that is not the end point, because what you do now, if you want to achieve the ultimate goal, I think then you go back and say, how can I convince these people? And I think this point came up in the beginning of this discussion, that is the aim of stakeholder engagement, to convince people to accept whatever your end goal is. And in most of our cases, it seems to be really that. If they say no, then you go back and say, why did they say no? And how can I respond to the concerns so that they say yes? Or what can I improve? And I think that also should be really the goal in case of gene drive, that even when you have groups that are against it, is you look, why are they against it? Are these valid concerns? Even if they're not valid concerns, why do they have these concerns? And how can we respond to them so that we can achieve whatever our goal is, if it's to implement the gene drive or the ultimate goal is to eliminate malaria. So yes, there are a lot of examples in research, especially when the project just does not move on because a certain group of stakeholders says no. And luckily, at least in our settings, the government does listen to the people. So then they say, if people say no, then make sure that you're able to convince them. And then so that is when more engagement is done. Sorry, thanks.
Thanks, Lina. Edie and then Francine.
Sure, I'll be quick because I notice we're close to end of time. So on your point about communication and language, in the research that we did in New Zealand, we found that when you use scientific language, and this was still written at the 6th grade level, but when you introduced gene drive from a scientific perspective and talked about all the scientific advances and the importance, although people found that those articles to be quite credible and they recognized them as being scientific and non-biased, they weren't effective. In fact, those articles that were written from a more humanitarian, so really values-based perspective, were much more effective in communicating. And this is classic framing. This is classic social science research. So my goal of being here on the panel would be one little tidbit of advice for the people that are listening is that if you want to have true engagement with your participants, your key stakeholders, your public, you must have it be values-based. Always have the science in the background, but you have to lead with values. And keep in mind, those aren't your values. Those are the people of the stakeholders that you're communicating with. So you have to do some time and wear your heart on your sleeve.
Thank you so much, Edie. So we have just a couple of minutes left, and we weren't able to get to every question in the chat, but I think our panelists have been monitoring those questions, and I think we've had a really rich and wide-ranging discussion this morning. What I'd like to do is just give each of the panelists a chance to make any kind of 20-second closing remarks that you might have. And we can go ahead and maybe start with you, Lina.
Thank you. I think my closing remark in this case would be that the engagement should be true engagement. Again, going back to gene drive and going back to malaria control, what we are seeing here is that we call it engagement, especially among the community members, but still the decisions are being made In TZ, the communities want population replacement, but I think there is an incoming research the communities want a population suppression approach, but the research that is coming is replacement. So that means the communities are not being heard. So I definitely, for the scientists researching gene drive, it would really make a difference to consider the opinions of the communities and all other stakeholder groups.
Thank you so much, Lina. Let's go to Steve. Any final closing remarks?
Okay, what was brought up earlier, maybe from Lina, about a lot is maybe from the scientific perspective, maybe a lot is not known, but with regard to gene drive, there is a lot that's known scientifically, and I think it's just possibly those researchers have not been able to get that out. But there is a lot there, and I think with gene drive, the benefit that might have to these areas, to these underserved communities, the public health value, I think that needs to be considered. I think, as Edie mentioned, I think they could be presented a lot better. Communication is important with that. And then I think, in order for things to move forward, it can't be caught up with this circular argument that Juan talked about. It just goes on and on indefinitely. I think sometimes, you have to look at the bigger picture, at the benefits of what this technology can give.
Thank you so much, Steve. Let's go to Edie, then Juan, and we'll have Francine close us out.
Yeah, I would just say that we need to keep in mind that engagement and consensus building is not about unanimous decision making, and it's not about forcing or convincing. It should be about really listening to what the different people want and then respecting their needs and having the guts to say no or having the guts to say yes when necessary.
Thanks, Edie. Juan?
Thank you. I find this issue fascinating, both because of the potential and also the uncertainties that it brings. But it's interesting to listen to Steve saying, there's a bunch of things that are really known and we need to get the message across. So I look forward to more conversations about how to do that.
Thanks, Juan. Francine?
So just thank you to all of you. This has been wonderful. Couple quick comments. Science is often looked at as a black box, and that's what makes it scary, and that's what makes these kind of conspiracy theories kind of come up. Plus, who's bringing the science? If that agency or entity is not trusted, right? And that's where you have that identity, us versus them conflict. So recognizing that any issue, whether it's this gene drive stuff or anything else, it is a microcosm of what's going on in society right now. And society is characterized by this very deep-rooted identity conflict, very polarizing. So recognizing that whatever process needs to address that microcosm. The issue of communication, absolutely agree about listening, and listening to not what is being said, but what is meant underneath that. Sometimes people put forward something that looks like a conspiracy theory, looks like it's irrational, looks like it's crazy, but what they're really asking for is to be heard, that their community, their group has not been included, has not been heard. And again, going back to Lina's point about really engaging that community, recognizing that they have intergenerational trauma, many of them, for not being included and for being, for racism and for all kinds of atrocities being committed against them. And so, yes, that process does need to go deep and reconcile that conflict. It needs to go wide in order to address that societal conflict within that context. And then it needs to have an eye for the long-term resilience and ability to adapt, because bad things will happen, conflict will arise, and not every solution is going to be the right solution or is going to be without its flaws. And so it's those relationships in that process that allow you to adapt and evolve over time and address problems when they come up. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Francine. And thank you so much to all of our panelists this morning. It's been my privilege and pleasure to be involved in hearing your views this morning, or today, this morning, afternoon, and evening. I believe I turn it back over to Royden now to close us out.
Wow, thank you very much, Synonym, Edie, Francine, Juan, Lina, and Steve for putting the thought and energy towards our effort of better understanding the role of of consensus and stakeholder engagement. And thank you to all of the participants for joining the call today and asking meaningful questions. Please take note, the next and last session of this series will be held on June 8th in the North and South American hemispheres, and will focus on the issue of independence of stakeholder engagement activities. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Todd Kukin of North Carolina State University. We look forward to another inspiring discussion and hope that you will join us. Thank you and see you next month.